I've been aching down there. The words hung in the desert air like a loaded gun. Luke Tanner, the fastest card sharp in New Mexico, never imagined his reckless bet would lead to this. A mail-order bride confession that would shatter everything he thought he knew about marriage, pride, and the quiet woman now standing before him with tears in her eyes. This is the story of how a gambler's arrogance became his salvation. Stay until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The Dusty Spur Saloon squatted on the corner of Main Street like a tired old prospector, its weathered planks groaning under the weight of too many secrets and too much whiskey. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the kind of tension that made smart men check their sidearms and fools reach for another drink. Luke Tanner was neither smart nor foolish. He was something far more dangerous, confident. He sat at the corner table, his usual spot, where the light from the oil lamps caught the planes of his face just right, casting shadows that made him look like the devil's own accountant, tallying up souls. His fingers moved across the cards with the kind of grace that came from 1,000 games, 1,000 wins, 1,000 men who'd walked away lighter in the pocket and heavier in regret. "Read 'em and weep, gentlemen," Luke drawled, laying down a full house with the casual air of a man commenting on the weather. The pile of coins and crumpled bills in the center of the table might as well have had his name carved into them. Across from him, Big Tom Morrison's face had gone the color of a New Mexico sunset, all red and angry, with storm clouds brewing behind his eyes. Big Tom owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, and he wasn't accustomed to losing at anything, especially not to a drifter with nimble fingers and a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. "You're cheating," Big Tom said, but there was no conviction in his voice. They both knew Luke didn't need to cheat. That was the worst part. Luke's smile was slow and lazy, like a cat that had already caught the mouse and was just playing now. "That's a serious accusation, Tom. You got proof, or you just got sour grapes?" The other men at the table, Jenkins the banker, old Pete from the livery, and young Danny Cooper, who was too green to know better, shifted uncomfortably. Nobody wanted to be there when Big Tom's temper finally broke its leash, but nobody wanted to miss it either. The Dusty Spur had been the stage for more than one legend, and legends were currency in a town where entertainment came at the cost of someone else's dignity. "I got a proposition," Big Tom said, pushing back from the table with enough force to make his chair scrape across the floor like fingernails on a coffin lid. "One more hand. Winner takes all." Luke's eyes flickered with interest. This was the moment he lived for, when the stakes climbed so high that the air itself seemed to thin out, when every card drawn was a heartbeat, every bet placed a small death or resurrection. "I'm listening." "If I win," Big Tom continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet saloon, "I get everything on that table, plus that fancy silver-plated colt you're so proud of, plus your horse." A murmur ran through the crowd that had gathered. Luke's horse was a magnificent beast, a black stallion with a white star on its forehead that could outrun anything on 4 legs within 100 miles. And the colt, that was more than a weapon. It was a piece of art, engraved with scrollwork that had cost Luke 3 months of winnings. "And if I win?" Luke asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Big Tom's smile was ugly. "If you win, you get double what's on the table. But there's a catch." He paused, letting the moment stretch like taffy. "You also get yourself a wife." The saloon erupted. Men laughed so hard they had to hold on to the bar to keep from falling. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered like the sound of Luke's reputation about to be tested. "A wife?" Luke's voice cut through the laughter like a knife through butter. "What kind of bet is that?" "The best kind," Big Tom said, and now his smile showed teeth. "You marry the quietest woman in town, Anna Blake, the store clerk. Girl so invisible you probably walked past her 100 times and never noticed. You're always bragging about your freedom, about how no woman will ever tie you down. Let's see how you like being tied to one who won't even give you the satisfaction of an argument." The laughter redoubled. Luke felt heat crawl up his neck, but he kept his face impassive. Anna Blake. He tried to place the name and came up empty. That itself was telling. In a town of barely 400 souls, being forgettable was almost an achievement. "That's not even a fair trade," Luke said carefully. "You're right," Big Tom agreed. It's not, because I also throw in $500 cash and the deed to that 40 acres bordering Cottonwood Creek. You know, the parcel with the good water rights. Now that changed things. $500 was more than most men in this territory saw in 2 years. And that land, Luke had heard about that land. It was fertile, protected from the worst of the desert winds, with a creek that ran even in the dry months. A man could build something real there, could stop drifting, could put down roots, could trap himself. And all I have to do is marry some quiet girl? Luke's mind was already calculating the odds, the angles, the ways this could play out. That's right, proper church wedding in front of the whole town. You take her as your lawful wedded wife, in sickness and in health, all that biblical nonsense. Can't annul it, can't run off on her. You give it at least a year. You break those terms, you forfeit everything, the money, the land, and your reputation. I'll make sure everyone from here to Santa Fe knows Luke Tanner is a man who doesn't keep his word. The saloon had gone so quiet you could hear the wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. Every eye was on Luke, waiting to see if the gambler's nerve would finally break. Luke looked at the cards in his hand, then at the pile of money on the table, then at Big Tom's piggy, triumphant eyes. The man thought he had Luke cornered, thought he'd found the one bet the famous gambler couldn't take. But Big Tom had made a critical error. He'd forgotten the most important rule of gambling. The house always thinks it has the advantage until the cards are revealed. "Deal," Luke said, and the word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. The crowd pressed closer. Whiskey was forgotten. The piano player's hands froze on the keys. Even the bartender stopped pretending to wipe down glasses and turned to watch. Jenkins shuffled the deck with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from excitement or drink, it was hard to say. The cards made their familiar whisper as they cascaded through his fingers. He dealt 5 to Luke, 5 to Big Tom, and the rest went down as the draw pile. Luke picked up his cards slowly, savoring the moment. This was what he lived for, the knife's edge between victory and disaster. The place where most men's nerves failed them, but where Luke Tanner had always found his footing. 3 queens smiled up at him from his hand. A pair of queens, specifically, the Queen of Hearts and the Queen of Diamonds, along with the Queen of Spades, plus a 7 and a 9, different suits. Not bad. Not great. Workable. "How many cards?" Jenkins asked, his voice hoarse. 2, Luke said, discarding the 7 and 9. He kept his face perfectly neutral, giving nothing away. Big Tom studied his own hand for a long moment, his brow furrowed. 1, he finally said, and there was something in his voice, a confidence that made Luke's instincts prickle. Jenkins dealt the replacements. Luke picked up his new cards and felt his heart kick once, hard, against his ribs. The King of Spades and the King of Hearts. Full house. Queens over kings. It was a beautiful hand, the kind that won serious pots and broke lesser men. Luke had to work to keep the satisfaction off his face. Big Tom's one-card draw suggested he'd been holding 2 pair, or possibly 3 of a kind, hoping to improve. The odds of him catching a 4th or filling a full house were slim. The odds had always loved Luke Tanner. "Well," Big Tom said, "you want a show, or you gonna sit there mooning over your cards all night?" Luke took his time, letting the moment breathe. This was the part of gambling most people didn't understand. It wasn't just about the cards or the odds. It was about the performance, the psychology, the way you controlled the narrative of the game itself. "I'll show," he said finally, and laid his cards face up on the table with the careful precision of a man presenting a work of art. Full house, queens over kings. The crowd made a noise that was half gasp, half groan. It was a hell of a hand. Luke allowed himself a small smile and reached for the pot. "Not so fast," Big Tom said, and there was something in his voice that made Luke's hand freeze. Big Tom laid down his cards one at a time, like a man savoring each step to the gallows, where he was the hangman and Luke was the condemned. 10 of spades. Jack of spades. Queen of clubs. No, wait. Luke's mind stumbled. He already had the queens of hearts, diamonds, and spades. This was King of clubs. And finally, with a smile that split Big Tom's face like a crack in adobe, the ace of spades. "Royal flush," Big Tom said, and the words seemed to echo off the walls, off the ceiling, off the inside of Luke's skull where they ricocheted like bullets. The saloon exploded. Men shouted, laughed, pounded the bar, pounded each other's backs. Someone started playing the piano in a mad, discordant celebration. Luke sat frozen, staring at the cards spread before him like an accusation, a royal flush, the best possible hand in poker. The hand that beat everything else in creation. The hand that Luke had seen exactly 3 times in his entire gambling career, and never, not once, not ever, had it been played against him when the stakes were this high. "Looks like you're getting married, Tanner," someone shouted, and the crowd roared its approval. Luke's mind raced through the possibilities, the angles, the ways out. But Big Tom had been smart, smarter than Luke had given him credit for. The terms were ironclad, spoken in front of witnesses. In a place where a man's word was worth more than gold, where reputation was the difference between respect and a bullet in the back, Luke couldn't welch on the bet. Not without destroying everything he'd built. Not without proving he was just another tin-horn gambler who couldn't back up his bravado. "When's the wedding?" Luke heard himself ask, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant, like it was coming from underwater. "Tomorrow," Big Tom said, clearly relishing every syllable. 2:00, at the church. I'll make sure Anna and her father know. Wouldn't want the bride to be unprepared." His laugh was mean and satisfied. "Welcome to matrimony, Tanner. May it be everything you deserve." The crowd surged forward, pounding Luke on the back, offering congratulations that felt more like condolences, buying rounds to toast his impending doom. Luke moved through it all like a man in a dream, his mind still stuck on that impossible royal flush, on the way luck had turned on him like a rabid dog. He'd gambled on everything in his life: money, horses, pride, freedom. He'd always won because he'd always been willing to risk it all. But now, staring at the reality of his situation, Luke realized he'd finally made the one bet he couldn't win. By sunset tomorrow, he'd be married to a woman he'd never met, tied to a life he'd spent 32 years avoiding, trapped in the very cage he'd always sworn would never hold him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the fear. Luke stumbled out of the dusty spur sometime past midnight, his head swimming with whiskey and regret. The desert night was cool against his face, stars scattered across the black sky like dice thrown by a careless god. He walked without direction, his boots scuffing against the hard-packed dirt of Main Street, past the general store and the bank and the land office, all the institutions of civilization that he'd always kept at arm's length. Marriage. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He'd seen what marriage did to men, watched them go from wild and free to tethered and tame, their spirits dimming like lamps running out of oil. His own father had been one of those men, before his mother died, before the bottle became his only companion, before young Luke had learned that the only person you could rely on was yourself. Never get attached. Never let anyone close enough to hurt you. Never, ever let yourself need another human being. Those had been Luke's cardinal rules, the gospel by which he'd lived his entire adult life. And now, because of one hand of cards, one moment of overconfidence, those rules were about to be shattered. He found himself standing outside the general store. Hastings Mercantile, the sign read, letters faded by years of sun. The windows were dark, but Luke could make out the shapes of goods inside. Sacks of flour, coils of rope, bolts of fabric. Ordinary things for ordinary lives. Anna Blake worked here. The quiet girl. The invisible woman he was supposed to marry in. He checked his pocket watch in the moonlight. Less than 14 hours. What did she look like? What did she sound like? Did she want this marriage any more than he did? Or was she being forced into it by a father eager to get rid of an unwanted daughter? The questions multiplied in his mind like rabbits, and he had answers to none of them. "You're a fool, Tanner," he muttered to himself, and the night wind carried his words away like smoke. He walked back to the boarding house where he kept a room. Had kept a room, he corrected himself, because married men didn't live in boarding houses, did they? They lived in homes with their wives, ate meals at actual tables instead of from the nearest plate in whatever saloon would serve them, woke up next to the same person every morning instead of riding out with the dawn. The thought made his chest tight. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house proprietor, was snoring loud enough to wake the dead when Luke crept up the stairs. His room was small and spare. A bed, a chair, a table with a wash basin, and a trunk containing everything he owned in the world. A gambler's life, a drifter's life, a free man's life. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots, each movement feeling heavy and strange. In the morning, everything would change. In the morning, Luke Tanner, as he'd known himself, would cease to exist. He thought about running, just saddling his horse and riding out before dawn, leaving Big Tom and his smug victory and this whole cursed town in the dust. He could be in Colorado before they even realized he was gone. Could start over somewhere new where nobody knew about the bet or the wedding or the gambler who couldn't keep his word. But even as the thought formed, he knew he wouldn't do it. Couldn't do it. Because for all his faults, for all his wandering and gambling and refusing to settle, Luke Tanner had never been a coward, had never run from a debt or broken his word once given, even if that word was going to cost him everything he'd ever valued. He lay back on the bed, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling where shadows moved in the light from the street below. Tomorrow, he would marry a stranger. Tomorrow, his life as he knew it would end. Tomorrow, the loneliest cowboy in New Mexico would discover that the greatest gamble of his life wasn't made across a card table. It was about to be made across an altar, with vows instead of bets, and a silent woman holding cards he couldn't read. The irony of it all would have made him laugh if his chest hadn't felt so tight. Outside, a dog barked at the moon, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle mourned its way through the darkness, heading somewhere else, anywhere else, to all the places Luke Tanner would never go. He closed his eyes and waited for morning. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Luke woke to sunlight stabbing through the thin curtains like accusations, his mouth tasting of whiskey and regret, his head pounding with the rhythm of his own stupidity. For one blessed moment, he didn't remember. Then it all came crashing back. The cards, the bet, the wedding that was now less than 6 hours away. He dragged himself to the wash basin and splashed water on his face, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the table. The man looking back at him had dark circles under his eyes and a jaw that needed shaving. He looked like exactly what he was, a gambler who'd finally lost the one game that mattered. "Pull yourself together, Tanner," he muttered, reaching for his razor. "It's just a wedding. People survive them every day." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a sentence. "A year minimum," Big Tom had said. And in a town this size, everyone would be watching to make sure he kept his end of the bargain. A year of playing house with a woman he didn't know, didn't want, and would probably grow to resent. He dressed carefully, choosing his best shirt, or rather, his least worn shirt, and the black vest he saved for high-stakes games. If he was going to walk into this trap, he'd do it looking like a man who'd chosen it rather than one who'd stumbled into it drunk and overconfident. The boarding house was quiet as he descended the stairs, his boots echoing on the worn wood. Mrs. Henderson was in the kitchen, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon made his stomach turn. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. "Mr. Tanner," she said when he appeared in the doorway, her voice careful. "I heard about the wedding. Congratulations." The word hung in the air between them, and they both knew it was the wrong one. "Thank you," Luke said anyway, because what else was there to say? She poured him coffee in a chipped mug, her movements efficient. "Anna Blake is a good girl. Quiet, but good. Her mother died when she was young, and she's been helping her father run the store ever since. Works hard, doesn't complain, keeps to herself." Luke took the coffee and wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat burn his palms. "That's more than I knew an hour ago." "She deserves better than to be the punchline of a saloon bet," Mrs. Henderson said, and there was steel in her voice now. "But then again, maybe you do too. Maybe this is exactly what both of you need." Luke wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Mrs. Henderson had been running this boarding house for 20 years, had seen more men come and go than Luke had dealt cards. If she saw something he didn't, who was he to argue? He drank his coffee in silence and left before she could say anything else that might make him think. The town was already awake and buzzing with gossip. Luke could feel eyes on him as he walked down Main Street, women peering from windows, men pausing their work to watch him pass, children whispering and giggling behind their hands. By noon, everyone in 3 counties would know that Luke Tanner, the gambler who'd sworn he'd never be caught, was about to be married to the quietest girl in town. He found himself walking toward the church, almost against his will, his feet carrying him while his mind was still trying to find an escape route that didn't exist. The church was a small adobe building on the edge of town, its white walls bright in the morning sun, its wooden cross casting a shadow that pointed east like an omen. Father Rodriguez was sweeping the steps when Luke arrived. He was a small man with kind eyes and hands that had seen hard work, and he looked up with something like sympathy when he saw Luke approaching. "Mr. Tanner," he said quietly, "I was told to expect you today." "Is she here?" Luke asked, and then realized he didn't even know what he was asking. Is she willing? Is she angry? Is she as trapped as I am? "Miss Blake and her father were here earlier to make arrangements. They will return at 2 o'clock, as agreed." Father Rodriguez leaned on his broom and studied Luke with eyes that seemed to see too much. "This is not how I prefer to conduct marriages, Mr. Tanner. Marriage should be entered into with joy and commitment, not because of a wager made in a moment of pride." "Then refuse to do it," Luke said, and he hated the desperate edge in his voice. "I cannot. Miss Blake has agreed to the marriage, as have you. In the eyes of God and this community, your word is binding." The priest's voice was gentle but firm. "What I can tell you is this. Marriage is not a trap, Mr. Tanner. It is a door. What lies beyond that door depends entirely on whether you choose to walk through it with an open heart or a closed one." Luke wanted to laugh at the simplicity of it, at the idea that something as complicated as his life could be reduced to open or closed, willing or unwilling. But Father Rodriguez had already turned back to his sweeping, and Luke was left standing on the steps of a church that would seal his fate in a matter of hours. He walked away without looking back, his mind churning. He needed a drink. He needed to think. He needed... "Luke Tanner!" The voice came from behind him, rough and commanding. Luke turned to find Jacob Blake standing in the doorway of the general store, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a big man gone to seed, his belly straining against his vest, his face red from years of sun and drink. Luke had seen him around town but had never had cause to speak to him, until now. "Mr. Blake," Luke said, keeping his voice neutral. "Inside," Jacob said, and it wasn't a request. The store was dim and cool after the brightness of the street, smelling of leather and coffee and the indefinable scent of goods waiting to be sold. Jacob walked behind the counter and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, pouring 2 glasses without asking if Luke wanted one. "To your wedding," Jacob said, his voice heavy with irony, and drank. Luke took the glass but didn't drink. "Where's your daughter?" "Upstairs, getting ready, or crying, or both. Hard to tell with Anna. She doesn't show much." Jacob poured himself another glass, and Luke noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "You know why I'm doing this? Because Tom Morrison asked you to? Because it's good for business? Because you want her off your hands?" Luke heard the bitterness in his own voice and didn't care. "Because she said yes," Jacob said, and the words hit Luke like a fist to the gut. "When Tom came to me yesterday laughing about his clever bet, I told him no. Told him my daughter wasn't some prize to be wagered, but Anna..." He paused, staring into his glass. "Anna said she'd do it. Said it was her choice, and she was choosing to marry you." Luke set his glass down carefully, afraid he might break it otherwise. "Why would she do that?" "Because she's 24 years old and has never been courted by a single man in this town. Because she works herself to the bone in this store and has nothing of her own. Because maybe, just maybe, she thinks even a marriage born from a bet is better than the life she's got now." Jacob's eyes were red-rimmed and angry. "So here's what I'm going to tell you, Tanner. You treat her right, or I'll forget I'm a God-fearing man and shoot you myself. Bet or no bet, she's still my daughter." Before Luke could respond, a door opened at the back of the store, and a woman's voice called down, "Papa, is someone there?" The voice was soft but clear, with a quality Luke couldn't quite place, something steady, something that didn't waver or question. He found himself holding his breath, waiting. "Just a customer," Jacob called back. Then quieter, to Luke, "Get out. Come back at 2 o'clock. And for God's sake, try to look like a man who isn't walking to his own funeral." Luke left without another word, the whiskey untouched, Jacob's warning ringing in his ears. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, and the day was growing hot. He had 3 hours until the wedding. 3 hours until his life changed forever. He spent them walking the edges of town, past the last houses and into the scrub desert beyond, where the earth was red and broken, and the only sound was the wind through the sage. He thought about his father, dead 10 years now from drink and bitterness. He thought about all the towns he'd drifted through, all the games he'd won, all the women he'd charmed and left behind. He thought about freedom and what it actually meant, whether it was the ability to go anywhere or just the loneliness of never staying. When he finally turned back toward town, the sun was high and merciless, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. He cleaned up as best he could at the boarding house, changed into his wedding clothes, and tried not to think about the fact that his hands were shaking. The church was packed when he arrived at 5 minutes before 2. It seemed like the entire town had turned out to watch Luke Tanner finally get caught, their faces showing everything from pity to amusement to outright glee. He walked down the aisle with his back straight and his face carefully blank, aware of every whisper, every sidelong glance. Big Tom Morrison sat in the front row, his smile so wide it looked painful. Next to him was his wife, a thin woman with a pinched face who looked like she'd been baptized in vinegar. Luke met Tom's eyes for just a moment and saw the satisfaction there, the joy of a man who'd finally won after losing too many times. Father Rodriguez stood at the altar, his expression carefully neutral. Luke took his place and turned to face the door, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. The church grew quiet. Someone coughed. A child whimpered and was quickly shushed. Luke waited, and every second felt like an hour. Then the door opened, and Anna Blake walked in. Luke's first thought was that she didn't look like someone walking to a forced wedding. She didn't look frightened or resigned or even particularly nervous. She looked calm, her chin up, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She wore a simple dress, not white, but a pale blue that made her skin look luminous in the dim church light. Her dark hair was pinned up, revealing a long neck and delicate features that Luke realized with shock were actually quite lovely. She wasn't invisible at all. She'd just been overlooked. Jacob Blake walked beside her, his face set like stone, his big hand wrapped around her small one. They moved down the aisle together, and Luke watched them come with a strange feeling in his chest, something between dread and curiosity, and a third thing he couldn't name. When they reached the altar, Jacob placed Anna's hand in Luke's, and Luke felt the shock of contact. Her skin was warm and dry, her fingers slender but strong. She looked up at him for the first time, and Luke saw that her eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds over the desert. They were steady and unafraid, and they saw him in a way that made Luke want to look away. But he didn't. He held her gaze and tried to read what was written there, tried to understand what kind of woman would agree to marry a stranger to escape a store clerk's life. "Dearly beloved," Father Rodriguez began, his voice carrying across the crowded church, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words washed over Luke like water. He heard himself responding when prompted, heard Anna's soft voice beside him saying the same vows, felt the weight of a ring, where had that come from, as he slipped it onto her finger. Her hands didn't shake. His did. "Do you, Luke Tanner, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" The church was so quiet Luke could hear the wind outside, could hear someone's stomach rumbling 3 rows back, could hear the sound of his own fate being sealed. "I do," he said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. "Do you, Anna Blake, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Anna's voice was clear and unwavering. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by God, and the territory of New Mexico, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Luke turned to Anna, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her gray eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first crack in that calm facade. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but she didn't move. Their lips met in the briefest of touches, formal and awkward and over in a heartbeat. The church erupted in applause and laughter, people surging forward to offer congratulations that felt more like condolences. Luke felt hands pounding his back, heard voices calling his name, saw faces swimming before him in a blur of motion and noise. Through it all, Anna stood beside him, her hand still in his, her face composed and distant. They were hustled outside into the brutal afternoon sun, where someone had set up tables with food and drink for a wedding reception that Luke suspected Big Tom had paid for out of pure spite. People crowded around, eating and drinking and laughing at the spectacle of Luke Tanner married, while Luke himself stood apart with his new wife, feeling like a man watching his own life from a great distance. "Well, Mrs. Tanner," Big Tom said, appearing at Anna's elbow with a glass of punch, "how does it feel to be married to the most confirmed bachelor in 3 territories?" Anna took the glass with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I wouldn't know, Mr. Morrison. I've only been married for 10 minutes. It was the first full sentence Luke had heard her speak, and her voice was different than he'd expected. Not meek or timid, but measured, as if she weighed each word before releasing it. Big Tom laughed, delighted. "Well, you've got spirit anyway. You're going to need it. Married to this one." He clapped Luke on the shoulder hard enough to hurt. "Enjoy married life, Tanner. That 40 acres and the money will be transferred to you tomorrow, as agreed. All you have to do is stay married for a year. Should be easy, right?" He walked away still laughing, and Luke felt Anna's hand slip out of his. When he looked down, she was staring after Big Tom with an expression Luke couldn't quite read. "You know what you agreed to?" Luke asked, keeping his voice low. "You know this whole thing is a punishment, that I'm stuck with you and you're stuck with me because I was too proud to fold?" Anna turned those gray eyes on him, and now there was something sharp in them, something that cut through the careful calm. "I know exactly what I agreed to, Mr. Tanner. The question is, do you?" Before he could answer, she was moving away into the crowd, accepting congratulations with quiet grace, leaving Luke standing alone in his own wedding reception with the distinct feeling that he'd somehow lost another hand without even knowing the game had started. The reception dragged on for hours. Luke drank more than he should have and smiled until his face hurt, and accepted the good-natured ribbing from men who couldn't believe their luck, that the untouchable Luke Tanner had finally been caught. Some of the jokes were cruel, some were crude, and all of them made Luke want to get on his horse and ride until the desert swallowed him whole. Anna moved through the crowd like a ghost, there, but not quite present, smiling at the right moments and saying the right things, but never showing anything real beneath the surface. Luke watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, trying to understand this woman who was now legally bound to him, trying to see past the calm exterior to whatever truth lay beneath. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that hurt to look at, the crowd finally began to thin. People drifted away in 2s and 3s, back to their own homes and lives, leaving the newlyweds standing in the church square surrounded by the debris of celebration. Jacob Blake approached them as the last guests were leaving, his face drawn and tired. He looked at his daughter for a long moment, and Luke saw something pass between them, some wordless communication that spoke of years of shared silence. "The house on Cottonwood Lane," Jacob said finally, addressing Luke. "It's been prepared for you. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and furnished, part of the land deal with Morrison." He paused, then added, "Anna's things are already there." Luke nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The reality of it was crashing down now. He had a house, a wife, a life he hadn't planned and didn't want. Jacob turned to Anna and pulled her into an awkward embrace. "You know where I am if you need me," he said gruffly, and Luke heard the unspoken words beneath. "If he hurts you, if you change your mind, if this was a mistake." "I know, Papa," Anna said softly. "I'll be fine." Then Jacob was walking away, his shoulders hunched, and Luke and Anna were alone for the first time as husband and wife. The silence between them was massive and uncomfortable. Luke cleared his throat. "I suppose we should go see this house." "I suppose we should," Anna agreed, her voice neutral. They walked side by side through the dusty streets as the light began to fade, neither speaking, the space between them feeling like a chasm. People watched from windows and doorways, and Luke knew the gossip would be burning through town like wildfire. What were they saying to each other? Were they fighting already? Would the marriage last the week, let alone the year? Cottonwood Lane was on the eastern edge of town, a dirt road that led toward the open desert. The house was small but sturdy, adobe walls and a tile roof with a covered porch and shuttered windows. The cottonwood tree that gave the lane its name stood in the front yard, its leaves whispering in the evening breeze. Luke opened the door. It wasn't locked, and they stepped inside together. The house was indeed clean and simply furnished. A main room with a fireplace and a table, a small kitchen area, and two doors leading to what Luke assumed were bedrooms. Someone, probably Jacob, had lit lamps against the coming darkness, and the warm light made the space feel almost welcoming. Almost. Anna moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking the kitchen stores, adjusting a crooked picture frame, running her hand along the back of a chair. Luke stood in the center of the main room and felt like an intruder in his own life. "There are two bedrooms," Anna said without looking at him. "You can take whichever one you prefer. I don't expect—" She paused, and for the first time Luke heard uncertainty in her voice. "We don't have to pretend this is a real marriage. We both know what it is." "And what is it?" Luke asked, surprised by his own question. Anna finally turned to face him, and in the lamplight her face looked different, younger, maybe, or more vulnerable than the mask she'd worn all day. "It's a business arrangement. You get your money and your land, I get a name and a house of my own. That's all. We can be civil to each other, keep up appearances for the town, and in a year we can go our separate ways." It made perfect sense. It was exactly what Luke should have wanted, a clean arrangement with no messy emotions, no expectations beyond the bare minimum. But hearing her say it so matter-of-factly, with no hint of disappointment or regret, stung in a way he didn't expect. "Fine," he said, his voice coming out harder than he'd intended. "That's fine." "Good." Anna smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture that seemed at odds with her composed face. "Then I'll say goodnight. It's been a long day." She disappeared into one of the bedrooms and closed the door with a quiet click that sounded final. Luke stood in the main room for a long time, listening to the house settle around him, feeling the weight of the ring on his finger like a shackle. This was his life now. This house, this silence, this woman who wanted nothing from him except the appearance of propriety. He'd gambled for freedom and ended up in a cage of his own making, trapped not by bars but by vows spoken in a church and witnessed by a town that would never let him forget. He finally made his way to the second bedroom and lay down on the narrow bed without bothering to undress. Through the thin wall, he could hear small sounds, Anna moving around, water pouring into a basin, the creak of bed springs as she settled for the night. His wife. The words still didn't feel real. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and moaning through the cottonwood tree. Luke closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept spinning through the events of the day, through every choice that had led him to this moment. The cards, the bet, the wedding, the cool, composed woman on the other side of the wall who seemed to want nothing to do with him. Maybe this was what he deserved. Maybe this was the universe's way of teaching him that you couldn't run forever, that eventually luck ran out and consequences caught up, and pride led to exactly the kind of trap you'd spent your whole life avoiding. Or maybe, whispered a small voice in the back of his mind, maybe this was the universe giving him something he didn't know he needed. But that thought was too big and too terrifying to examine in the darkness of his wedding night, so Luke pushed it away and waited for morning, for the strange new life that would begin when the sun rose on his first full day as someone's husband. Dawn came slowly to Cottonwood Lane, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose that Luke watched through the bedroom window without really seeing. He'd barely slept, his mind too full of the strangeness of waking up married, of knowing there was another person in this house who had every right to be here and yet felt like a stranger. When he finally gave up on sleep and emerged from his room, the house was silent except for the ticking of a clock he hadn't noticed the night before. Anna's door was closed. Luke moved quietly through the main room, not wanting to disturb her, and found that someone, probably her father, had stocked the kitchen with coffee and flour and eggs and all the mundane necessities of domestic life. He stood staring at the supplies for a long moment, realizing with something like embarrassment that he'd never made coffee in a house before. Saloons, yes. Over campfires, certainly, but in an actual kitchen with proper equipment, he was lost. He was still trying to figure out the coffee pot when Anna's door opened. She emerged dressed in a simple work dress, her hair already pinned up, looking as composed as if she'd slept soundly for 8 hours instead of spending her wedding night alone in a stranger's house. Her eyes took in the scene, Luke standing helplessly with the coffee pot, the scattered supplies, the confusion written all over his face. And something flickered across her features too quickly for him to identify. "The water goes in the bottom chamber," she said quietly, crossing to the kitchen and taking the pot from his hands without asking. "Coffee grounds in the basket on top. Then you put it on the stove and wait for it to percolate." Luke watched her efficient movements and felt something twist in his chest. Shame, maybe, or inadequacy. Here was his wife, teaching him how to make coffee in his own house because he'd spent 32 years avoiding the very concept of domesticity. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out stiff. Anna glanced at him, and for a moment he thought he saw pity in her gray eyes. Then she was turning away, busying herself with pulling out a pan and checking the eggs. "I'll make breakfast. You should probably go see about that land transfer Mr. Morrison promised you." It was a dismissal, polite but firm, and Luke took it. He grabbed his hat and left the house, stepping out into a morning that was already warming toward hot. The town was waking up around him. Shopkeepers opening their doors, horses being led to the livery, children running through the streets with the boundless energy of youth. Everything looked the same as it always had, but Luke felt fundamentally changed, marked somehow by the ring on his finger and the woman in his house. The land office was a small building near the bank, run by a clerk named Perkins, who wore spectacles and had ink stains on his fingers. He looked up when Luke entered and couldn't quite hide his smirk. "Mr. Tanner, or should I say, the married Mr. Tanner, congratulations on your nuptials." The words dripped with amusement. "Mr. Morrison was here earlier. Everything's in order. The deed to the 40 acres is ready for transfer, and the money has been deposited in an account in your name at the bank." Luke took the deed when Perkins offered it, studying the legal language that said this land, 40 acres of New Mexico desert with good water rights and fertile soil, was now his. On paper, it should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like looking at the receipt for his own soul. "There's a clause," Perkins said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "written at Mr. Morrison's insistence and witnessed by Judge Crawford. The land and money remain yours only as long as the marriage remains valid for a minimum of 1 year. If you abandon your wife, seek annulment, or otherwise violate the terms of the agreement, everything reverts to Mr. Morrison." He paused. He was very thorough. Of course he was. Big Tom had won, and he wanted to make sure Luke couldn't wriggle out of it on a technicality. "I understand," Luke said, folding the deed and tucking it into his vest pocket. The bank was next, where another smirking clerk confirmed that $500 had indeed been deposited in Luke's name. It was more money than Luke had ever had in one place at one time, enough to live on for a year or more if he was careful, enough to build something real if he wanted to. The problem was, Luke had no idea what he wanted to build. He'd spent his entire adult life avoiding permanence, and now he was drowning in it. He walked back toward Cottonwood Lane slowly, dreading the return to that house and the awkward silence that waited there. But when he pushed open the door, Anna was gone. The breakfast she'd made, eggs and bacon and fresh bread, sat on the table growing cold, and a note in neat handwriting said simply, "Gone to help Papa at the store. There's food if you're hungry." Luke ate mechanically, tasting nothing, then spent the rest of the day wandering his 40 acres of land like a man surveying his prison. The property was good. Morrison hadn't lied about that. The creek ran clear and steady even in the heat, and the soil looked rich enough to support crops or grazing. There was a flat area that would be perfect for building a larger house, and a grove of cottonwoods that offered shade from the brutal sun. It was everything a man settling down could want. Luke hated every inch of it. The next few days fell into an awkward pattern. Anna would rise early and leave for the store before Luke was fully awake. She'd return in the evening, cook dinner in that efficient, silent way of hers, and then retreat to her room. They spoke only when necessary. "Pass the salt? Do we need more firewood? I'll be working late tomorrow." and even those minimal exchanges felt forced and uncomfortable. Luke spent his days on the land working with his hands for the first time in years. He cleared brush and repaired the small fence that marked the property line and tried not to think about the fact that he was playing house with a woman who looked at him like he was a burden she'd agreed to carry. At night, he lay in his narrow bed and listened to Anna moving around on the other side of the wall and wondered what she was thinking, whether she regretted her choice, whether this cold civility would be the shape of their entire year together. It was on the fourth night that the storm came. Luke had been asleep, or as close to sleep as he ever got anymore, when the sound of wind jerked him awake. Not the normal desert wind that whispered and moaned, but something fiercer, angrier, the kind of wind that meant serious weather moving in. He sat up just as the first drops of rain hit the roof, and within seconds, it had become a torrent. Desert storms were violent and fast, dumping months' worth of rain in a matter of hours. Luke scrambled out of bed and into the main room just as a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house. Through the window, he could see the cottonwood tree bending nearly double, its branches thrashing like the arms of a drowning man. Another sound cut through the roar of wind and rain, a splintering crack from above. Luke looked up in time to see a section of the roof sag inward, tiles sliding and crashing down into the yard outside. Water began pouring through the gap, cascading onto the floor in a miniature waterfall. "Anna!" Luke shouted, pounding on her door. "We've got a problem." She emerged in her nightdress with a shawl thrown over her shoulders, her hair loose and falling past her shoulders in a way Luke had never seen. For a moment, he was struck dumb by the sight of her, this woman he'd married but didn't know, looking vulnerable and beautiful and terrifyingly real in the flickering lamplight. Then another piece of roof gave way with a groan, and there was no time for anything but action. "We need to catch the water," Anna said, her voice cutting through his paralysis. "Pots, buckets, anything that will hold liquid. If it damages the floor too badly, the whole structure could be compromised." They worked together in frantic silence, placing every container they could find under the leaks that were multiplying by the minute. The wind was getting worse, howling through the gaps in the roof like something alive and angry. Luke grabbed a ladder from the shed outside, getting soaked to the skin in the process, and climbed up to try to secure some of the loose tiles. "What are you doing?" Anna shouted from below. "You'll break your neck." "Better than losing the whole roof," Luke shouted back, wrestling with a tile that was determined to fly away into the storm. He managed to secure 2 tiles before a gust of wind nearly knocked him off the ladder. He climbed down, breathing hard, water streaming down his face. Inside, Anna was moving from bucket to bucket, emptying them out the door when they got too full, her nightdress soaked through and clinging to her frame, her hair plastered to her face. She looked up when he came back in, and for the first time since he'd met her, Luke saw genuine fear in her eyes. "It's not stopping," she said. "The storm. It's not stopping." She was right. If anything, the wind was picking up, and now Luke could hear an ominous creaking from the remaining roof structure. If they lost much more of it, the house would be uninhabitable. And in a storm like this, with the rain coming down sideways and the lightning turning the night into intermittent day, there was nowhere safe to go. "The back bedroom," Luke said suddenly. "It's on the lee side of the house. The roof there should be more protected. We need to move anything valuable and wait it out." They worked together, hauling blankets and supplies into the smaller room, piling them in a corner away from the window. The main room was flooding now, water ankle-deep and rising. Luke grabbed the deed to the land and the small amount of cash he kept in the house, then turned to find Anna standing in the doorway of her own room, clutching something to her chest. "Come on," he called over the roar of the storm. "We need to stay together." She hesitated for just a moment, and in that moment, Luke saw something crack in her composure, some wall she'd been keeping carefully in place. Then she was moving toward him, still holding whatever she'd rescued from her room, and they crowded together into the back bedroom and shut the door against the chaos outside. The small room felt even smaller with both of them in it, their wet clothes dripping onto the floor, the single lamp casting shadows that jumped and twisted with each gust of wind. Luke could hear the storm still raging, could feel the whole house shuddering under the assault, and for the first time since he'd arrived in this town, he felt something like genuine fear. Not fear of dying. He'd faced that plenty of times before. Fear of failing. Of losing this house that represented a bet he couldn't afford to lose. of proving to the whole town that he was exactly what they thought he was, a drifter who couldn't hold on to anything real even when it was handed to him. "Sit down," Anna said quietly. "There's nothing more we can do until the storm passes." They sat side by side on the floor with their backs against the wall, close enough that Luke could feel the heat radiating from her body, could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair despite the rain. She was still holding the object she'd rescued, a small wooden box worn smooth with age and handling. "What's that?" Luke asked, because the silence felt too heavy and he needed to fill it with something. Anna looked down at the box as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. "My mother's," she said softly, "the only thing I have left of her. Letters she wrote, a few pieces of jewelry, some drawings I made as a child that she saved." She paused. "Silly, I suppose, to risk going back for it when the house was flooding." "Not silly," Luke said, and meant it. "We all have things we'd save from a burning building." "What would you save?" Anna asked, turning those gray eyes on him. In the lamplight, they looked almost silver. The question hit Luke harder than it should have. What would he save? His gun? Maybe, because it was valuable. His horse, because it represented freedom. Cards, because they were his livelihood. But none of those things felt important enough to risk his life for. None of them were irreplaceable. "I don't know," he said finally, and the admission felt like failure. Something shifted in Anna's expression, not pity exactly, but understanding. "That must be lonely," she said quietly, "having nothing you'd fight for." Before Luke could respond, a tremendous crash shook the house so hard that dust rained down from the ceiling. Anna gasped and grabbed his arm instinctively, her fingers digging into his bicep. Luke froze, intensely aware of her touch, of how small her hand looked against his arm, of the way her whole body was trembling. "Hey," he said softly, surprising himself with the gentleness in his own voice. "It's all right. The house is solid. We're safe here." You don't know that," Anna said, but she didn't let go of his arm. "No," Luke admitted, "but I'm betting on it anyway." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Luke saw something in her face he hadn't seen before, a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the woman underneath the careful composure. "Is that what you do? Just bet on things and hope they work out?" "Pretty much," Luke said, "though my track record suggests it's not the best strategy." To his surprise, Anna laughed, a soft, brief sound that was immediately swallowed by another roll of thunder, but unmistakably a laugh. "No," she agreed. "I suppose it's not." They sat in silence for a moment, Anna's hand still on his arm, the storm raging around them. Then, so quietly Luke almost missed it over the wind, Anna said, "I was going to leave." Luke went very still. "What?" 3 months ago, I had saved enough money to buy a train ticket to San Francisco. I was going to leave Papa and the store and this town where everyone looks through me like I'm made of glass. She was staring at the wall now, not at Luke. But the night before I was supposed to go, Papa got drunk and told me about how my mother had made him promise to take care of me, how it was the last thing she said before she died. And I realized I couldn't do it. Couldn't leave him alone with his guilt and his whiskey. "So you stayed," Luke said. "I stayed. And I watched other girls get married and have children and build lives, while I worked in that store day after day, becoming more invisible with every year that passed." She finally looked at him again. "When Mr. Morrison came with his bet, I thought, this is it. This is my chance to have something of my own, even if it's just a business arrangement with a man who doesn't want me. At least it's mine." The words hung between them, raw and honest in a way their previous conversations had never been. Luke felt something shift in his chest, some understanding clicking into place. She wasn't the punishment in this arrangement. She was the other prisoner. "I'm sorry," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "I'm sorry you got stuck with me because I was too arrogant to fold." Anna's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "And I'm sorry you got stuck with me because Big Tom Morrison thought it would be funny. For what it's worth," Luke said carefully, "you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone meek, someone who would fade into the background and let me pretend this marriage wasn't happening." He paused. "But you're not meek at all, are you?" "No," Anna said simply. "I'm just quiet. There's a difference." Before Luke could ask her to explain the difference, another crash split the air, this one clearly from inside the house. They both jumped to their feet and opened the bedroom door to find that a section of the main room ceiling had collapsed entirely, bringing with it a torrent of rain and debris. The furniture was overturned, the floor was a lake, and through the hole in the roof, Luke could see the churning black sky. "Oh God," Anna breathed beside him. Luke's mind raced, calculating damage and cost, and the very real possibility that the house was beyond saving. But then something Big Tom had said came back to him. The house was part of the land deal, but the land itself was the real prize. As long as they survived the night, as long as the marriage held, the land was still his. They could rebuild. "We're going to be okay," he said with more confidence than he felt. "It's just a house. Houses can be fixed." "Can they?" Anna asked, and Luke wasn't sure if she was talking about the house anymore. The storm finally began to ease around 3 in the morning, the wind dropping from a scream to a moan, the rain slowing from a torrent to a steady patter. Luke and Anna emerged from the back bedroom like survivors of a shipwreck, surveying the damage in the gray pre-dawn light that filtered through the destroyed roof. The main room was devastated. The table was smashed, the chairs scattered and broken, the kitchen supplies ruined by water. But the walls still stood, and the foundation looked intact. It was bad, but Luke had seen worse. "Well," Anna said, her voice remarkably steady considering they'd just spent half the night huddled together in fear. "I suppose we have work to do." She rolled up her sleeves and started pulling salvageable items from the wreckage, sorting them into piles with the same efficient determination she brought to everything. Luke watched her for a moment, this woman who'd agreed to marry a stranger and was now wading through ankle-deep water to save what remained of their accidental home, and felt something he hadn't expected. Respect. He joined her in the cleanup, working side by side as the sun rose and the full extent of the damage became clear. It would take weeks to repair, maybe months. They'd need help, need supplies, need money beyond what Big Tom had provided. But as Luke looked at Anna, her hair still loose and drying in messy waves, her nightdress filthy and torn, her face set with determination, he realized something else. For the first time since he'd lost that card game, he wasn't alone in this mess. It would take weeks to repair, maybe months. They'd need help, need supplies, need money beyond what Big Tom had provided. But as Luke looked at Anna, her hair still loose and drying in messy waves, her nightdress filthy and torn, her face set with determination, he realized something else. For the first time since he'd lost that card game, he wasn't alone in this mess. For the first time in years, someone had stood beside him when things got hard instead of walking away. She hadn't blamed him, or complained, or dissolved into useless tears. She'd grabbed buckets and fought the storm, and kept her head when everything was falling apart. Maybe, Luke thought as he pulled another broken chair from the water, marriage wasn't just a trap. Maybe it was also a partnership, if you were lucky enough, or smart enough, or desperate enough to let it be. "Anna," he said, and she looked up from the pile of waterlogged linens she was sorting. "Thank you for not panicking, for helping." She studied him for a long moment, those gray eyes seeing too much again. "You came back," she said finally. "What?" "When the storm hit, you could have run, could have left me here alone and ridden out to somewhere safe, but you came back. You fought for the house." She paused. "Why?" It was a fair question, and Luke didn't have a good answer, because he'd given his word. Because the house represented money and security. Because some part of him, despite everything, couldn't stomach the idea of leaving anyone, even a virtual stranger, to face a disaster alone. "Of course I did," he said finally, echoing her words from the storm, and realized, with something like surprise, that he'd wanted to. That when he'd heard that first crack of breaking roof tiles, his first thought hadn't been for the land or the money or his own safety. It had been, Anna's in there. Something flickered across Anna's face. Surprise, maybe? Or the beginning of trust. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. Instead, she just nodded once and went back to work. They spent the rest of the morning clearing debris and assessing damage. By the time the sun was high and hot, baking the wet earth into steam, they'd managed to make the back bedroom and a small corner of the main room habitable. It wasn't much, but it was something. Luke walked outside to survey the property and found neighbors already arriving, people he barely knew coming to help clean up storm damage, because that's what people did in places where community mattered more than pride. Jacob Blake was among them, his face drawn with worry until he saw Anna emerging from the house dirty but unharmed. "You're all right?" he called, rushing toward her. "We're fine, Papa," Anna said, and there was something different in her voice, a confidence that hadn't been there before. "The house took some damage, but we'll repair it." "You should come stay at my place until it's fixed," Jacob said, shooting a dark look at Luke. "It's not safe here." "No," Anna said firmly. "This is my home now. We'll manage." Jacob looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Anna's stance, the set of her shoulders, the lift of her chin, stopped him. He glanced between his daughter and Luke saw the exact moment when Jacob realized that something had changed between them. Some boundary had shifted in the night of storm and struggle. "All right," Jacob said slowly, "but if you need anything, we'll ask," Anna finished. "Thank you, Papa." The neighbors worked through the afternoon, helping to clear the worst of the debris and secure what remained of the roof with tarpaulins. Luke found himself working alongside men who'd laughed at him at his own wedding, and while they still made jokes at his expense, there was less edge to them now. Maybe surviving a storm together earned you a kind of grudging acceptance. Maybe just showing up and working instead of running gave you a measure of respect. By evening, the house was at least protected from any further weather, and the helpers began to drift away to their own homes and dinners. Luke and Anna were left standing in their battered main room, exhausted and filthy, the lamplight casting long shadows across the drying floor. "I'll cook something," Anna said, but her voice was heavy with fatigue. "Sit down," Luke said. "You've been working all day. I can manage." She looked at him with surprise, then sank into one of the few remaining intact chairs without argument. Luke rummaged through their salvaged supplies and managed to put together a simple meal of beans and bread, nothing fancy but hot and filling. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the cold, careful distance of previous days. This silence was companionable, born of shared exhaustion and the strange intimacy of surviving something together. "You know," Anna said as she pushed her empty plate away, "I never asked you why you were at that saloon. Why you took Mr. Morrison's bet in the first place." Luke considered lying, or deflecting, or giving her some practice story, but something about the events of the day, the storm, the confession in the small bedroom, the way she'd looked at him when he'd come back, made him want to tell the truth. "Because I'm a coward," he said. Anna's eyebrows rose. "That's not the word most people would use for a gambler." "It's the right word, though. I've spent my whole life moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or make connections or risk caring about anyone or anything. I told myself it was freedom, but it was really just fear. Fear of ending up like my father, trapped and bitter. Fear of needing someone and having them leave. Fear of building something and watching it fall apart." He paused, surprised by his own honesty. "When Big Tom made that bet, I should have walked away. Should have recognized it for the trap it was. But I was too proud, too certain I couldn't lose, and maybe—" He stopped, not sure he wanted to finish the thought. "Maybe what?" Anna prompted softly. "Maybe some part of me wanted an excuse, wanted to be forced into staying, into trying, because I knew I'd never have the courage to choose it on my own." He met her eyes across the table. "I'm sorry you got caught up in my cowardice." Anna was quiet for a long moment, her face thoughtful. Then she said, "I don't think it's cowardice to be afraid of getting hurt. I think it's just being human. And I don't think you're as much of a coward as you believe." "No?" "No. A coward would have left when the storm hit. A coward wouldn't have climbed a ladder in a gale to try to save a house he didn't even want. A coward wouldn't have stayed to help clean up when the damage was done." She paused. "A coward wouldn't have just told me the truth." Luke felt something warm spread through his chest, something he couldn't quite name. "What about you?" he asked. "What made you say yes to this marriage? Really?" Anna looked down at her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was tired of being invisible. Tired of watching life happen to other people while I stood behind a counter and faded away a little more each day. When Mr. Morrison came with his ridiculous bet, everyone expected me to refuse. expected me to be too proper, too afraid, too quietly dignified to agree to something so scandalous. She looked up, and there was fire in her gray eyes now. But I was so tired of being what everyone expected. So I said yes. I said yes to being the punchline of a joke, to marrying a stranger, to becoming the talk of the town, because at least it meant I was finally visible, finally doing something instead of just existing. The fire faded as quickly as it had come, and her voice dropped again. I don't regret it. Even with the storm and the damage and the awkwardness between us, I don't regret it. For the first time in my life, I have something that's mine, even if it's just a broken house and a business arrangement marriage. Luke looked at this woman, his wife, and saw her clearly for the first time. Not the quiet store clerk or the invisible girl or the burden he'd been saddled with. Just Anna, brave and honest and tired of hiding. It doesn't have to just be a business arrangement, he heard himself say. Anna's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? I mean, Luke struggled to find the words. I mean, maybe we could try to be friends, partners, people who actually talk to each other instead of tiptoeing around each other like strangers. He paused. I know I'm not what you would have chosen, but as long as we're stuck together, maybe we could try to make it bearable, maybe even good. For a long moment, Anna just stared at him, and Luke couldn't read her expression. Then slowly she smiled, and it transformed her entire face, chasing away the careful composure and revealing something warm and genuine underneath. I'd like that, she said simply. They finished their meal in a silence that felt, for the first time, comfortable. When Anna finally stood to clear the plates, Luke helped without being asked, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen space with an ease that hadn't been there before. Later, as they prepared for bed, both exhausted to the bone from the long day of work, Luke paused outside Anna's bedroom door. She was standing just inside, still wearing the borrowed dress someone had brought her since her nightdress was ruined. Good night, Anna, he said. She turned and gave him that same genuine smile. Good night, Luke. He lay in his bed that night listening to the sounds of the house settling, the drip of water from remaining leaks into strategically placed buckets, and the distant sound of Anna moving around in her room. For the first time since that disastrous card game, Luke didn't feel trapped. He felt something else, something uncertain and fragile but unmistakably real. Hope. Retry. The weeks that followed the storm brought changes that Luke couldn't have predicted. The house repairs became a shared project rather than just another obligation, with Anna proving to have opinions about everything from the placement of new roof tiles to the color of paint for the kitchen walls. She'd stand with her hands on her hips, surveying their progress with a critical eye that reminded Luke of a general inspecting troops, and he found himself actually caring what she thought. The porch needs to be wider, she announced one morning, startling Luke, who'd been measuring lumber. If we're going to spend evenings out here when the weather cools, we need room for proper chairs. Luke looked up from his work, sawdust coating his arms. Evenings on the porch? That sounds almost domestic. We are domestic, Anna pointed out, her tone matter-of-fact. Whether we planned it or not, might as well make it comfortable. She had a point, and Luke found himself rebuilding the porch to her specifications, adding an extra 4 feet of width and even constructing a small bench where they could sit and watch the sunset. It was strange, building something permanent, something designed for a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine. But with Anna beside him, handing him nails and offering suggestions and occasionally laughing at his mistakes, it felt less like a trap and more like a choice. The town had noticed the change too. Luke could see it in the way people nodded to them on the street now, in the way the gossip had shifted from mockery to something approaching respect. The gambler and his quiet wife had survived a storm that had damaged 6 properties, and they'd done it together. In a territory where survival often depended on partnership, that meant something. Anna had started teaching Luke to cook, real cooking, not just the basic trail food he'd survived on for years. She had patience he didn't deserve, guiding his hands as he learned to knead bread dough, explaining the difference between simmering and boiling, laughing when he added salt instead of sugar to a cake batter. You're hopeless, she said one afternoon, but her voice was warm with affection rather than criticism. I'm learning, Luke protested, trying to salvage the over-peppered stew he'd been attempting. Give me time. How much time? A year? The words hung between them for a moment. a reminder of the deadline that still loomed over their arrangement. Then Anna smiled. I suppose we'll find out. They'd fallen into a rhythm of evenings together, Anna mending clothes or reading while Luke worked on repairs or sat with the land deed, planning improvements to the property. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they just existed in the same space, comfortable in their shared silence. Luke found himself looking forward to these evenings more than he wanted to admit, to the sound of Anna's voice as she read passages aloud from whatever book had caught her interest, to the way lamplight caught in her hair and made it shine like polished wood. But the most surprising change was the one in Anna herself. Away from her father's store and the town's expectations, she was blossoming like a desert flower after rain. She spoke more freely, laughed more easily, and showed a sharp wit that Luke suspected she'd been hiding for years. She'd also started asking Luke to teach her things, how to ride his horse, how to shoot, how to read the land for water and game. Why do you want to learn to shoot? Luke asked one morning when she brought up the subject again. Because I'm tired of being helpless, Anna said simply. The storm showed me that. When things went wrong, I knew how to cook and clean and manage a household, but I didn't know how to protect myself or survive if I had to. I want to learn. So Luke taught her. They spent afternoons in the scrubland beyond their property, with Luke showing Anna how to hold a rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze rather than pull the trigger. She was a quick study, her natural steadiness translating well to marksmanship. Within 2 weeks, she could hit a tin can at 30 yards. Within a month, she rarely missed. You're a natural, Luke said, genuine admiration in his voice, as Anna knocked down 3 cans in rapid succession. I had a good teacher, she replied, and the smile she gave him made something warm bloom in Luke's chest. It was during one of these practice sessions that trouble found them. Luke had just finished setting up new targets when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. 3 riders crested the small rise to the east, and even from a distance, Luke could tell they weren't friendly visitors. The way they sat their horses, the way they spread out as they approached, these were men looking for trouble. Anna, Luke said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Get behind me. But Anna didn't move. She stood her ground, the rifle still in her hands, her face calm but alert. Who are they? Nobody good, Luke muttered as the riders drew closer. He recognized them now, drifters who'd been hanging around the dusty spur for the past week, causing just enough trouble to get noticed, but not enough to get thrown out. The leader was a man called Red Jack, named for his rust-colored hair and his temper. The other 2 were his shadows, mean-eyed and eager for violence. Red Jack pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet away, his hand resting on his sidearm in a gesture that was deliberately casual and deliberately threatening. Well, if it ain't the married man, heard you got yourself hitched to win a bet. That true? Luke kept his voice level. That's my business. See, I think it's interesting business, Red Jack continued, his smile showing too many teeth. Man who's lived free as long as you suddenly tied down. Makes a fellow wonder if maybe you're losing your edge, getting soft. Luke could feel the weight of his Colt against his hip, could calculate the distance between them, the angles of fire, the odds of taking all 3 men down before one of them got a shot off. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't good either. We don't want any trouble, he said carefully. Just out here doing some target practice. You boys should move along. Maybe we will, Red Jack said. But first, I'm curious about something. They say your wife's a real quiet type. Bet she'd be even quieter if someone taught her to show proper respect to her betters. The threat was clear, and Luke felt rage ignite in his chest, hot and immediate, and stronger than anything he'd felt in years. His hand moved toward his gun, but before he could draw, the crack of a rifle shot split the air. Dirt exploded at Red Jack's horse's feet, causing the animal to rear and nearly throw its rider. The other 2 men reached for their weapons, but another shot rang out, this one hitting the hat clean off the nearest man's head. Luke turned to find Anna with the rifle at her shoulder, her stance perfect, her face set in an expression of cold fury that transformed her completely. She worked the bolt action smoothly and sighted down the barrel again, this time aiming directly at Red Jack's chest. The next one doesn't miss, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. And I suggest you ride out now, before I decide you're trespassing and deal with you accordingly. For a moment, nobody moved. Red Jack stared at Anna like she'd sprouted a second head, clearly unable to reconcile the quiet store clerk with the woman currently pointing a rifle at his heart. Then one of his companions spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "Jack, that's Luke Tanner's wife, the gambler. Maybe we should—" "I know who she is," Red Jack snapped, but he'd gone pale under his tan, and his hand had moved away from his gun. He looked between Luke and Anna, seemed to be calculating odds and finding them unfavorable, then spat in the dirt. "This ain't over, Tanner." "Yes, it is," Anna said, her voice steel wrapped in velvet. "Unless you'd like to test whether I'm bluffing, I promise you, I'm not." Red Jack yanked his horse's head around and spurred away without another word, his two companions following. Luke watched them until they disappeared over the rise, then turned to Anna. She was lowering the rifle slowly, her hands beginning to shake now that the danger had passed. "Are you all right?" Luke asked, moving to her side. "I think so." Anna's voice was unsteady now. "My God, I just threatened to shoot a man." "You saved us both," Luke said, and he meant it. "If you hadn't fired when you did, this could have ended very differently." He paused. "Where did you learn to shoot like that under pressure? You've only been practicing for a month." Anna looked up at him, and there was something fierce and proud in her eyes. "I told you. I was tired of being helpless. I meant it." Luke felt something shift in his chest. Not just respect or gratitude, but something deeper and more complicated. This woman who'd been sold as the punishment in a bet, who everyone had dismissed as quiet and forgettable, had just faced down 3 armed men without flinching. She'd protected their property, protected him, with a steady hand and a courage that most men twice her size couldn't muster. "You're amazing," he said, and the words came out rough with emotion. "You know that? You're absolutely amazing." Anna's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "I had something worth protecting," she said quietly. "That makes it easier to be brave." They walked back to the house in silence, but Luke was intensely aware of Anna beside him, of the rifle slung over her shoulder like it belonged there, of the way she'd changed from the woman he'd married into someone stronger, fiercer, more fully herself. And he was aware of something else too, the realization that somewhere between the storm and the shooting lessons and the evenings on the rebuilt porch, he'd stopped thinking of this marriage as a punishment. He'd started thinking of it as a gift. The story of Anna facing down Red Jack and his men spread through town like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew that Luke Tanner's quiet wife could shoot, and shoot well. The women whispered about it in the general store, the men discussed it over drinks at the Dusty Spur, and children acted it out in the streets, taking turns being either Anna or the outlaw she'd faced down. Luke noticed the change in how people treated Anna. Where before they'd overlooked her or dismissed her, now they gave her space on the boardwalk, nodded respectfully when she passed, asked her opinion on matters they would have previously ignored her about. She'd earned something precious in this territory, a reputation, not as someone's daughter or someone's wife, but as herself. Jacob Blake came to dinner that week, ostensibly to check on the house repairs, but really, Luke suspected, to see his daughter for himself. He sat at their new table, the one Luke had built with Anna supervising, and ate the meal they'd cooked together, his eyes moving between them with an expression Luke couldn't quite read. "I heard about Red Jack," Jacob said finally, addressing Anna directly. "Heard you sent him packing with his tail between his legs." "I fired a warning shot," Anna said modestly. "That's all." "That's not what I heard. I heard you put his hat off at 50 yards and would have put the next one through his heart if he hadn't run." Jacob paused. "Your mother would have been proud. She had steel in her spine too, though most people never saw it. Something passed between father and daughter, some understanding or healing that Luke wasn't part of. Then Jacob turned to Luke and his expression was grave. "You're taking care of her." It wasn't a question, but Luke answered anyway. "She takes care of herself. I just try to keep up." Jacob's lips quirked in what might have been approval. "Good. That's how it should be." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "You know, when Morrison came with that bet, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to Anna. Thought I was failing her by letting it happen. But maybe—" He looked at his daughter, at the strength in her stance and the confidence in her eyes. "Maybe sometimes the worst thing turns into the best thing, if you're brave enough to let it." After he left, Anna stood on the porch staring after him, and Luke saw tears on her cheeks. "He's never said anything like that to me before," she said softly. "Never acknowledged my mother and me. Never said he was proud." Luke moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You've given him a lot to be proud of lately." "So have you," Anna said, turning to look at him. "The house, the land, the way you've worked instead of running. Papa respects that. This town respects that." "I don't care what the town thinks," Luke said, and realized it was true. "I care what you think." Anna's breath caught, and in the fading light, her eyes looked more silver than gray. "Luke." Whatever she was about to say was interrupted by the sound of more horses approaching. Luke tensed instinctively, his hand moving toward his gun, but these riders were different, official. Sheriff Coleman rode at the head of a small group, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. "Evening, folks," the sheriff called, dismounting. "Sorry to bother you, but I need to have a word with Mr. Tanner, privately." Anna's hand found Luke's, her fingers lacing through his in a gesture of support that felt more intimate than any kiss. "Anything you need to say to my husband, you can say in front of me." The sheriff looked between them, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. It's about Red Jack and his boys. They rode into town an hour ago, drunk and talking big about how they're going to teach Luke Tanner a lesson for letting his woman disrespect them. I've got them cooling off in the jail, but Tanner—" He paused. "They're not going to let this go. Men like that, when they feel they've been humiliated, they don't forgive. And with 3 of them against the 2 of you out here alone, we can handle ourselves," Anna said firmly. "I don't doubt it, ma'am. But handling yourself against 3 armed men looking for revenge is different than handling yourself in a fair confrontation." The sheriff's expression was serious. "I'm not saying you need to leave your property. I'm saying you need to be prepared. Keep your weapons close, watch your backs, and if you see them coming, you ride straight for town and let me deal with it legally." Luke nodded slowly. "Understood. Thank you for the warning." After the sheriff left, Luke and Anna stood in the gathering darkness, the weight of the threat hanging between them. Finally, Luke spoke. "You should stay at your father's place for a while, until this blows over." "No," Anna said immediately. "Anna, be reasonable. If they come here looking for trouble—" "Then we'll handle it together," she interrupted, her voice brooking no argument. "I'm not running. This is my home. Our home. And I'm not leaving it." Luke wanted to argue, wanted to insist, wanted to protect her from the danger that was coming. But looking at her face, determined and unafraid, he knew she wouldn't budge. And truthfully, he didn't want her to. The woman standing beside him wasn't the quiet, invisible girl who'd walked down the aisle 6 weeks ago. She was someone who'd found her strength and wasn't going to hide it anymore. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this smart. We set up a watch rotation, keep the rifles loaded, and we don't take any chances. Agreed?" "Agreed," Anna said. Then, so quietly Luke almost missed it. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not trying to send me away, for trusting that I can handle this." She paused. "For treating me like a partner instead of a burden." Luke reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. It was the first time he'd touched her so deliberately, so tenderly, and he felt her lean into the contact just slightly. "You've never been a burden, Anna. I was just too stubborn to see it." They spent that night taking turns on watch, one sleeping while the other sat by the window with a rifle across their lap. When Luke took his turn watching, he found himself studying Anna's sleeping form in the lamplight, the way her hair spilled across the pillow, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, the small smile that played at her lips even in sleep. Somewhere between the storm and the shooting lessons and the quiet evenings, he'd stopped seeing her as the consequence of a lost bet and started seeing her as Anna. Just Anna. Complex and brave and beautiful in ways he was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in that transformation, he'd fallen halfway in love with her. The thought should have terrified him. Love was the ultimate trap, the thing he'd avoided his entire adult life because it meant giving someone the power to hurt you, to leave you, to break you open and leave you bleeding. But sitting in the darkness of their home, watching over the woman who'd chosen to stay beside him even when danger threatened, Luke found he wasn't afraid. He was grateful. 3 days passed without incident. Luke and Anna maintained their watch rotation, kept their weapons close, and went about the business of living. Anna still helped her father at the store during the day, though Luke insisted on walking her there and back. They worked on the house in the evenings, and slowly, it was beginning to look less like a disaster site and more like a home. It was on the 4th day that Red Jack made his move. Luke was working on reinforcing the barn door when he heard Anna scream, not a scream of fear, but a warning. He spun around to see 3 riders thundering toward the house, Red Jack in the lead with a pistol already drawn. The other 2 were fanning out, clearly planning to surround the property. Luke ran for the house, his heart hammering, his mind calculating distances and angles. He burst through the door to find Anna already at the window, rifle in hand, her face pale but determined. "I've got the front," she said quickly. "You take the back. They're trying to flank us." Luke grabbed his own rifle and moved to the back window just as one of Red Jack's men appeared around the corner of the house. The man was aiming at the front window, at Anna, and Luke didn't hesitate. He fired, hitting the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man's gun flew from his hand and he scrambled for cover, cursing. From the front of the house, Luke heard Anna's rifle crack once, twice, then her voice clear and strong. "The next one goes through your chest, Red Jack. I don't miss twice." "You can't hold us off forever, bitch," Red Jack shouted back. "Eventually you'll run out of bullets or nerve, and when you do—" "When I do, you'll be dead," Anna interrupted, "because my husband is one of the best shots in this territory, and between the 2 of us, we can hold this house against 6 of you, let alone 3. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get on your horses and ride out, and you're never going to come back, because if you do, I will hunt you down and shoot you myself." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Red Jack laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Anna said, and Luke heard the steel in her voice, the absolute conviction. "I've already put a bullet through your friend's shoulder. You really want to see what I do when I'm aiming to kill?" Luke moved back to the front room, keeping his rifle trained on the window, but positioning himself where he could see Anna. She stood like a soldier at her post, her aim steady, her jaw set. In that moment, she looked like an avenging angel, beautiful and terrible and absolutely unshakable. Red Jack must have seen it too, because after another moment of tense silence, Luke heard him curse and yell to his men, "This ain't worth it. Let's go." "That's right," Anna called after them, as the sound of retreating hoofbeats filled the air. "Run. And if I ever see you near my property again, I'll make good on my promise." They waited until the riders were completely gone before lowering their weapons. Anna turned to Luke, and now he could see the tremor in her hands, the shock beginning to set in now that the adrenaline was fading. Without thinking, Luke crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, burying her face in his chest, her whole body shaking. Luke held her tight, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped together in the middle of their front room, survivors of a battle neither had wanted but both had won. "You were incredible," Luke said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "The way you stood up to them, the way you held your ground." "I was terrified," Anna admitted, her words muffled against his shirt. "I thought they were going to kill us." "But you didn't run. You didn't back down. You stood beside me and fought." Luke pulled back just enough to look at her face, to cup her cheek in his palm. "Do you have any idea how rare that is? How amazing you are?" Anna looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears and something else, something that made Luke's heart stutter in his chest. "I had something worth fighting for," she whispered. "Someone worth fighting for." The air between them shifted, charged with something electric and inevitable. Luke's thumb traced her cheekbone, and Anna's breath hitched. They were standing so close that Luke could count her eyelashes, could see the pulse fluttering at her throat, could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. "Anna," he said, her name a question and a prayer. She answered by rising on her toes and kissing him. It wasn't like the brief, formal kiss at their wedding. This was real and raw and filled with weeks of building tension, of shared danger, of slowly falling for someone you never expected to need. Anna's hands fisted in Luke's shirt, pulling him closer, and Luke wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly as he deepened the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. Anna's face was flushed, and her eyes were wide. "I shouldn't have," she started, but Luke cut her off with another kiss, this one softer, but no less intense. "Don't apologize," he said against her lips. "Don't you dare apologize for that." "But our agreement," Anna tried again. "To hell with our agreement," Luke said fiercely. "Anna, I don't want a business arrangement anymore. I don't want to be civil roommates counting down to the end of a year. I want—" He paused, struggling to find words for feelings he'd never let himself have before. "I want this. Us. A real marriage, if you'll have it. If you'll have me." Anna's eyes searched his face, looking for truth, for certainty, for whatever would tell her this wasn't just adrenaline or gratitude or some temporary madness brought on by danger. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because her face softened into a smile that took Luke's breath away. "I'll have you," she said simply. "I think I've been having you for weeks now. I was just too afraid to say it out loud." Luke kissed her again, and this time it was a promise, a commitment, a choice made freely instead of under duress. When they finally broke apart, the sun was setting through the window, painting the room in shades of gold and amber, and Luke thought he'd never seen anything more beautiful than Anna Blake Tanner standing in their home, looking at him like he was someone worth loving. "So what now?" Anna asked, her voice still breathless. Luke grinned, a real grin, not the practiced gambler's smile, but something genuine and unguarded. "Now we stop pretending. Now we actually be married instead of playing at it." He paused. "Now I court my own wife properly, since I never got the chance to do it before." Anna laughed, the sound bright and free. "You want to court me? We've been married for over a month." "So?" "Nobody said courtship has to come before marriage. In our case, it makes more sense for it to come after." Luke took her hand, threading their fingers together. "What do you say, Mrs. Tanner? Will you let me take you to dinner, bring you flowers, and try to sweep you off your feet even though I've already got the ring on your finger?" "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Anna said. But she was smiling, and her eyes were shining, and when she spoke again, her voice was warm with affection. "Yes, yes, I'd like that very much." They spent the evening together on their rebuilt porch, watching the stars come out and talking about everything and nothing, their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the property and for themselves. Luke told Anna about his childhood, about his father's decline and his own years of running. Anna told him about her mother, about the store, about all the things she'd wanted but been too afraid to reach for. And somewhere in those hours of honest conversation, in the space between what had been and what could be, they built something new. Not a marriage born from a bet or a business arrangement or an obligation, but a real partnership founded on respect and trust and the beginning of love. When they finally went inside to sleep, Anna paused at her bedroom door. She looked at Luke, then at his door, then back at Luke. "I don't," she started, then stopped, uncertain. Luke understood what she wasn't saying, what she was asking without words. "There's no rush," he said gently. "We'll take this as slow as you want. I'm not going anywhere." Anna nodded, relief and maybe a touch of disappointment crossing her face. She stood on her toes and kissed him softly. "Good night, Luke." "Good night, Anna." But as Luke lay in his bed that night, he could hear Anna moving around on the other side of the wall, and he smiled into the darkness. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running towards something or away from something. He was exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly who he wanted to be with. The gambler who'd sworn he'd never be caught had finally been caught, and he'd never felt more free. The morning after their kiss brought a new awkwardness, but it was the good kind, the kind that came from possibility rather than regret. Luke woke to the smell of coffee and found Anna in the kitchen, her hair still loose from sleep, wearing an old dress and humming softly to herself. When she saw him, she blushed and smiled, and Luke felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "Good morning," she said, her voice a little shy. "Morning," Luke replied, crossing to her. He paused, uncertain of what was allowed now, what had changed between them. Then Anna rose on her toes and kissed him softly, answering his unasked question, and Luke pulled her close with a relief that bordered on joy. They ate breakfast together with their chairs pulled close, knees touching under the table, hands finding excuses to brush against each other. It felt ridiculously young and new, like they were teenagers courting instead of a married couple who'd been living under the same roof for weeks. But Luke found he liked it. This sense of discovery, of learning each other without the weight of obligation and resentment. "I need to go into town today," Anna said as they cleaned up the dishes. "Papa needs help with inventory, and Mrs. Henderson ordered some fabrics that came in yesterday." "I'll come with you," Luke said immediately. Anna raised an eyebrow. "You hate going into town. You always say it's full of gossiping busybodies." "It is full of gossiping busybodies," Luke agreed. "But I also said I wanted to court you properly. That includes escorting my wife into town and probably buying her something frivolous and unnecessary." "Frivolous and unnecessary?" Anna laughed. "Luke Tanner, are you going to buy me a gift?" "Maybe," Luke said, trying to look nonchalant and failing entirely. "Is that allowed?" Anna's expression softened into something tender. "It's very allowed, but you don't have to buy me anything. You've already given me everything I wanted." "What's that?" "A home. A partnership, yourself." Anna reached up and touched his face gently. "That's more than I ever hoped for." Luke caught her hand and kissed her palm. "Well, you're getting a gift anyway, so resign yourself to it." They rode into town together in the wagon Luke had purchased the week before, another sign of permanence, of planning for a future that extended beyond the terms of a bet. Anna sat beside him on the bench seat, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his, and Luke found himself acutely aware of every point of contact between them. The town was busy when they arrived, the main street crowded with people going about their morning business. Luke helped Anna down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary, and was rewarded with another of those shy smiles that seemed to be uniquely his. They walked toward the general store together, and Luke noticed the way people watched them, not with the mocking interest of before, but with something closer to approval. Apparently word had spread about Anna facing down Red Jack, and the town had decided that Luke Tanner's quiet wife was actually somebody worth knowing. "Mrs. Tanner!" called a voice, and they turned to find Mrs. Henderson hurrying toward them, her face bright with curiosity. "I heard about what happened with those dreadful men. Are you both all right?" "We're fine," Anna said graciously. "Thank you for asking." "Well, it's a good thing you learned to shoot. A woman needs to know how to protect herself and her home." Mrs. Henderson glanced between Anna and Luke, and her eyes sharpened with interest. "You two look different today. Happy. Something change?" Anna blushed, but didn't deny it. "Maybe we're just settling into married life." Mrs. Henderson said, clearly not fooled but too polite to push. "Well, it suits you both. Luke, you look almost domesticated." "Don't spread that around," Luke said with mock seriousness. "I have a reputation to maintain." "I think that reputation got buried under house repairs and marriage vows," Mrs. Henderson said cheerfully. "But don't worry, I think this version of you is an improvement." She bustled off, and Anna laughed quietly. "Domesticated. She's not wrong." "Is that bad?" Luke asked, suddenly uncertain. "No," Anna said, squeezing his hand. "It's perfect." They separated at the general store, Anna to help her father with inventory, Luke to wander the town and figure out what constituted an appropriate gift for a wife you were falling in love with despite starting off hating the very concept of marriage. He stood in front of the mercantile window, studying the displays of fabric and ribbons and women's things, feeling completely out of his depth. "You look lost, Tanner." Luke turned to find Big Tom Morrison standing behind him, that familiar smirk on his face. Luke felt his jaw tighten automatically, but forced himself to relax. Whatever else Tom had done, his bet had inadvertently given Luke something precious. That didn't mean Luke had to like the man, but it did mean he could be civil. "Just trying to figure out what to buy my wife," Luke said evenly. Tom's eyebrows rose. "Your wife?" "Not that woman I'm stuck with for a year." "Anna," Luke said firmly. "Her name is Anna. And no, not the woman I'm stuck with. My wife." Something shifted in Tom's expression. Surprise, maybe, or grudging respect. "Heard she sent Red Jack running. Heard she can shoot better than most men in this town. Heard you two survived that storm and rebuilt your place stronger than before." "We did." "And you're happy?" Tom asked, and for once there was no mockery in his voice. "Actually happy?" Luke thought about Anna humming in the kitchen that morning, about her kiss and her smile, and the way she'd stood beside him against armed men without flinching. He thought about their evenings on the porch and their easy conversations and the way she made him want to be better, to build something lasting, to stop running. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm happy." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. "I'll be damned. I made that bet to humiliate you, Tanner, to prove that the great Luke Tanner could be caught and broken like any other man. But instead," he gestured vaguely, "you actually made it work." "We made it work," Luke corrected. "Anna and I together. Not because of your bet, but in spite of it." "Fair enough." Tom shifted uncomfortably, looking almost embarrassed. "Look, I'm not going to apologize. I'm not that kind of man. But I will say this. You've surprised me. Both of you have, and that doesn't happen often. It wasn't an apology, but it was something." Luke nodded once, acknowledging the words without forgiving the intent behind the original bet. Then Tom was walking away, and Luke was alone again with the question of what to buy a woman who'd given him back his life. He ended up in the jeweler's shop, a small establishment he'd walked past 100 times without ever entering. The owner, an elderly man named Goldstein, looked up with interest when Luke came in. "Mr. Tanner, this is unexpected. What can I do for you?" Luke looked at the display cases full of rings and necklaces and brooches, all glittering in the light from the window. "I need something for my wife, something that says—" He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he'd never learned the words for. "Something that says she matters, that she's precious, that I see her." Goldstein studied Luke for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think I have something." He unlocked a case and pulled out a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a small bird in flight. This came from an estate sale in Santa Fe. The woman who owned it was known for her strength and independence. When I saw it, I thought of Mrs. Tanner, the way she's emerged from being overlooked to being someone the whole town respects. Luke took the necklace, feeling the weight of it in his palm. The bird was exquisitely detailed, its wings spread as if it were caught mid-flight, straining toward freedom and sky. It was perfect, a symbol of everything Anna had become, everything she'd always been underneath the quiet exterior. "I'll take it," Luke said. He left the shop with the necklace wrapped carefully in cloth, tucked safely in his vest pocket. As he walked back toward the general store, he found himself whistling, actually whistling, like a man without a care in the world. The irony wasn't lost on him. Months ago, he'd been a gambler with nothing to his name but a horse and a gun and his reputation. Now he was a husband with a home and a wife and a future, and somehow that felt more valuable than all the money he'd ever won. Anna was waiting for him outside the store, talking with her father. Jacob saw Luke approaching and gave him a nod that was almost friendly. "Tanner, heard you and Anna are doing well." "We are, sir." "Good." Jacob's hand landed heavy on Luke's shoulder. "You keep treating her right, you hear? She deserves it." "I know she does," Luke said, meaning every word. Jacob studied him for another moment, then smiled, actually smiled, something Luke had rarely seen. "I believe you do." "Well, I've got work to finish. Anna, come by for dinner this week?" "We will, Papa," Anna promised, kissing her father's cheek. After Jacob left, Anna turned to Luke with curiosity in her eyes. "What did you buy?" "You'll see later," Luke said mysteriously. "Come on, let's head home." They drove back to Cottonwood Lane in companionable silence, Anna's hand resting on Luke's thigh in a gesture of casual intimacy that still felt new and miraculous. When they arrived home, Luke helped Anna down from the wagon and, on impulse, swept her up into his arms. "Luke!" Anna squealed, laughing. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my wife over the threshold," Luke said. "We never did it properly the first time. Figured we should correct that oversight." "We've been living here for weeks." "So? Better late than never." Luke carried her through the door and set her down gently in their front room, now fully repaired and furnished with pieces they'd chosen together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Tanner. Again." Anna was still laughing, her face flushed and happy. "You're ridiculous." "Maybe, but I'm your ridiculous." Luke pulled the wrapped necklace from his pocket. I got you something. Anna's eyes widened as she carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing the silver bird. Her breath caught. Luke, it's beautiful. It reminded me of you, Luke said. The way you've learned to fly. The way you've become exactly who you were always meant to be, once you had the chance. Anna's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling as she held the necklace up to catch the light. Will you put it on me? Luke took the necklace with fingers that weren't quite steady and fastened it around Anna's neck. The silver bird settled just below her collarbone, catching the light with every breath. Anna touched it reverently, then turned to Luke with an expression that made his heart stop. I love you, she said, the words simple and devastating. I don't know when it happened, maybe during the storm, or when you taught me to shoot, or maybe it was happening all along and I just didn't recognize it. But I love you, Luke Tanner, and I needed you to know that. Luke felt something break open in his chest, some final wall he'd been keeping in place, some last defense against feeling too much. I love you too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. God help me, Anna. I love you so much it terrifies me. I never wanted this. Never wanted to need anyone or depend on anyone or give someone the power to hurt me. But you, he cupped her face in his hands. You made me want all of it, made me believe I could actually have it. Anna kissed him then, deep and sweet and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she took his hand and started leading him toward the bedrooms. But instead of turning toward her own room, she stopped at his door. Anna, Luke started, but she pressed her fingers to his lips. I'm sure, she said quietly, if you are. Luke answered by kissing her again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. They stumbled into his bedroom together, learning each other with hands and lips and whispered words. Everything they'd been building toward since the storm, since the kiss, since the moment they'd chosen to make this marriage real instead of just legal. It all culminated in the intimacy of finally, truly becoming husband and wife. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Luke's bed, Anna's head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. The silver bird necklace caught the afternoon light slanting through the window, and Luke felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. What are you thinking? Anna asked softly. That I'm the luckiest man alive, Luke said honestly. That I lost everything in a card game and somehow ended up winning more than I ever knew I wanted. Anna propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hair falling like a curtain around them. You didn't lose that card game, Luke. You won it. You just didn't know what the real prize was. And what was the real prize? This. Anna gestured to encompass the room, the house, the life they'd built together. Us. A real home. Someone to stand beside you instead of just passing through your life. She paused. Freedom. Freedom? Luke laughed softly. I'm married, tied down. The opposite of free. No, Anna said firmly. You were never free before. You were just running. From your past, from connection, from the possibility of being hurt. That's not freedom. That's just fear, with better scenery. She touched his face gently. But now? Now you're free to stay, free to build, free to love without always looking for the exit. That's real freedom. Luke stared at her. This woman who saw him so clearly, it was almost frightening. When did you get so wise? I've always been this wise, Anna said with mock superiority. You were just too stubborn to notice. They spent the rest of that day in bed, talking and laughing and making love again with the lazy pleasure of people who finally understood they had all the time in the world. As the sun began to set, painting their bedroom in shades of amber and rose, Luke pulled Anna close and felt something settle deep in his chest, a sense of rightness, of home, of finally being exactly where he was meant to be. The weeks that followed their consummation of the marriage were some of the happiest of Luke's life. He and Anna moved through their days with an ease that felt both comfortable and exciting, partners in everything from working the land to planning for the future. They combined their belongings into one bedroom, and Luke found he liked falling asleep with Anna in his arms and waking to find her still there, real and warm and his. They worked the 40 acres together, clearing more land and planting crops that would come in by fall. Anna proved to have a natural understanding of farming, and she directed their efforts with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Luke built fences and repaired the barn and did all the physical labor that made his muscles ache in a good way, and every evening he came home to find Anna waiting with dinner and a smile. But more than the work, it was the small intimacies that amazed Luke. The way Anna would touch his hand as she passed him. The way she'd sit in his lap while they talked on the porch in the evenings. The way she'd steal his hat and wear it while she worked in the garden just to make him laugh. All the little gestures of affection that he'd never known he was missing until Anna showed him what they felt like. Jacob became a regular visitor, often joining them for Sunday dinner and watching his daughter with barely concealed pride. The whole town had noticed the change in Luke and Anna, the way they walked close together, the way they looked at each other, the way they'd transformed from two people trapped by a bet into a genuine couple. "Never thought I'd see Luke Tanner domesticated," old Pete said one day at the general store, loud enough for Luke to hear. "But damned if that Blake girl didn't manage it." "Tanner girl," Anna corrected firmly from behind the counter where she was helping her father. "I'm Anna Tanner now." The casual claim, the pride in her voice when she said it, made Luke's chest tight with emotion. She wasn't just tolerating the marriage anymore. She was claiming it, claiming him, declaring to the whole town that she'd chosen this life and this man. Not everything was perfect. They had arguments, real ones, where Anna's quiet stubbornness clashed with Luke's ingrained independence. She wanted him to stop going to the Dusty Spur so often, said it made her worry when he came home smelling of whiskey and smoke. He wanted her to stop working at her father's store, said she was his wife now and didn't need to clerk anymore. They fought about money and chores and all the mundane things that couples fought about when they were learning to share a life. But they always made up, sometimes with passionate reconciliation in their bed, sometimes with quiet conversations on the porch, where they worked through their differences like the partners they were becoming. And each argument, each resolution, strengthened the foundation they were building. It was 3 months after their wedding that Anna woke Luke in the middle of the night, her hand on his shoulder, her voice uncertain in the darkness. "Luke, wake up." He came awake instantly, years of light sleeping making him alert. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, Anna paused, and even in the darkness, Luke could hear the emotion in her voice. "I've been feeling strange lately, tired, a little sick in the mornings, and I'm late." It took Luke's sleep-fogged brain a moment to understand what she was saying. Then the meaning hit him like a fist to the gut. "Late? You mean, I think I might be pregnant," Anna whispered. Luke sat up slowly, his mind reeling. A baby. They were going to have a baby. The thought was enormous, terrifying, miraculous. He reached for Anna in the darkness, pulling her close. "How do you feel about that?" "Scared," Anna admitted. "Excited. Overwhelmed. All of it at once." She was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Luke tried to inventory his emotions and found them too big and tangled to name. Fear, yes. He didn't know the first thing about being a father, about raising a child, about being responsible for a tiny life. But underneath the fear was something else. Hope, joy, a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "I feel like the luckiest man alive," he said finally. "Scared, but lucky." Anna laughed wetly, and Luke realized she was crying. He held her tighter, stroking her hair, murmuring promises into the darkness. That he'd be there, that they'd figure it out together, that their child, the words still felt unreal, would be loved and protected and wanted. They went to see the doctor the next day, a kindly older man named Harrison who'd been delivering babies in the territory for 30 years. He examined Anna and confirmed what they'd suspected. She was indeed pregnant, probably about 6 weeks along. The baby would come in early spring. "Congratulations," Dr. Harrison said warmly. "This is wonderful news. Mrs. Tanner is healthy and strong, and I see no reason why this shouldn't be a normal, healthy pregnancy." Luke held Anna's hand as they left the doctor's office, still trying to process the reality of it. A father. He was going to be a father. The man who'd spent 3 decades avoiding any kind of permanent attachment was now not just married, but expecting a child. The irony would have made him laugh if it hadn't made him want to cry. They told Jacob that evening over dinner, and the old man's face transformed with joy. "A grandchild," he breathed, his eyes growing misty. "Oh, Anna, your mother would have been so happy." "I wish she could have met them," Anna said softly, touching the silver bird at her throat. "She'll meet them in spirit," Jacob said firmly, "and she'll see what a fine mother you'll be, and what a good man your husband turned out to be." He raised his glass in a toast. To family, to the future, to second chances. They drank to that, Anna with water instead of wine, and Luke felt the weight of those words. Second chances. That's what he'd been given when he lost that card game and won a wife. A second chance to build a life, to become someone better than he'd been, to stop running and start living. And now he was being given another chance, to be the father his own father had never managed to be, to break the cycle of distance and disappointment, to give his child what he'd never had, a stable home, two parents who loved each other, and the security of knowing they were wanted. It was a daunting prospect. It was also the most important thing he'd ever attempt. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Anna suffered from morning sickness that often lasted well into the afternoon. Luke found himself hovering, worried every time she looked pale or tired. Anna tolerated his concern with amused patience, reminding him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of managing. But she also let him fuss over her, let him insist she rest more and work less, let him take over most of the heavy chores around their property. As her belly began to swell with their child, Luke found himself overcome with tenderness at odd moments, seeing her bent over the garden, one hand supporting her back, or watching her sew tiny clothes for the baby with a small, secret smile on her face. "I love you," he'd say out of nowhere, and Anna would look up with that radiant smile that still had the power to stop his heart. "I love you too," she'd reply, as natural as breathing. It was in the middle of Anna's 5th month, when winter was giving way to early spring and the desert was beginning to bloom, that Luke received an unexpected visitor. He was working on building a crib. His carpentry skills had improved dramatically in the months since their marriage, when a familiar voice called from the yard. "Tanner, you around?" Luke set down his tools and went outside to find Big Tom Morrison standing by his wagon, looking uncomfortable. Behind him in the wagon bed were several pieces of furniture, a rocking chair, a changing table, and what looked like a beautifully crafted cradle. "Morrison," Luke said carefully. "What's all this?" Tom shifted his weight, his face reddening. "Heard your wife is expecting. Heard you're building a nursery." He gestured to the wagon. "My wife made me bring these. They're from when our kids were babies. She says they're just gathering dust in our attic, and they should go to a family that can use them." Luke stared at the furniture, then at Tom, trying to process this gesture from a man who'd humiliated him in front of the whole town. "Why?" "Because my wife has a conscience, even if I don't," Tom said bluntly. "Look, Tanner, I'm not going to stand here and pretend we're friends. We're not. But you and Anna, you made something real out of my stupid bet. You proved me wrong, and my wife says that deserves recognition, not continued animosity." He paused. "So take the damn furniture and let me go home and tell her I did what she asked." Luke walked over to the wagon and ran his hand over the cradle. It was beautiful work, clearly made with love and care. "This is too generous." "It's practical," Tom corrected. "Like I said, we're not using it." He cleared his throat. "Also, I'm supposed to apologize for the bet, for using your pride against you and dragging Anna into it. My wife says it was cruel and I should be ashamed." Another pause. "She's right." It wasn't a graceful apology, but it was sincere. Luke could see the discomfort in Tom's face, the effort it took to admit fault. He thought about holding on to his anger, about nursing the grudge for what Tom had done. Then he thought about Anna, about their baby, about the life they'd built from the ashes of that bet. "Tell your wife thank you," Luke said finally. "For the furniture and for making you see sense." He offered his hand. "And Tom?" "I accept your apology." Tom shook his hand, relief evident in his face. "Your wife's good for you, Tanner. Better than you deserve, probably." "I know," Luke said, and he was grinning. "Believe me, I know." After Tom left, Luke carried the furniture inside piece by piece. Anna emerged from the bedroom where she'd been resting and gasped when she saw the cradle. "Luke, where did this come from?" "Big Tom Morrison. His wife sent it." Luke set the cradle down carefully in what would be the nursery. "It was an apology, I think, as close to one as Tom's capable of giving." Anna touched the cradle gently, her expression soft. "It's beautiful. Our baby will sleep here." Our baby. The words still sent a thrill through Luke every time he heard them. He crossed to Anna and pulled her into his arms, his hand resting on the swell of her belly where their child grew. "We're really doing this, aren't we? Building a family." "We really are," Anna agreed. She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with tears and happiness. "Do you ever regret it? The bet? The marriage? Giving up your freedom?" Luke thought about the question seriously, giving it the consideration it deserved. He thought about who he'd been 6 months ago, a drifter with no ties, no home, no one waiting for him at the end of each day. He thought about who he was now, a husband, a father-to-be, a man with a home and a wife and a future that stretched before him in ways he'd never imagined. "Not for a single second," he said honestly. "You didn't trap me, Anna. You set me free." They stood together in the half-finished nursery, holding each other as the afternoon light slanted through the window and the desert wind whispered around their home. The house on Cottonwood Lane that had been damaged and rebuilt, just like the people who lived in it. The marriage that had started as a punishment and become a blessing. The months passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Luke finished the nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and installing the furniture with Anna's supervision. They chose names, Matthew for a boy, Rose for a girl, both after grandparents who'd passed. Anna's belly grew round and full, and Luke marveled at the miracle of it, at the life they'd created together. When Anna's time came in late March, it was sudden and terrifying. Her water broke in the middle of the night, and Luke rode to fetch Dr. Harrison with his heart in his throat, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in that Anna and the baby would be all right. Jacob arrived shortly after, and they paced together outside the bedroom while the doctor and Mrs. Henderson attended to Anna inside. The labor was long, 14 hours that felt like 14 years to Luke. He could hear Anna crying out, could hear the doctor's calm instructions, and it took everything in him not to burst through that door and demand to be at her side. Jacob had to physically restrain him twice, reminding him that this was women's work and he'd only be in the way. Finally, when Luke was ready to tear the door off its hinges out of sheer terror and helplessness, he heard a new sound, the thin, reedy cry of an infant. His knees went weak with relief. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Tanner. You have a daughter, a healthy, beautiful daughter. And Anna did wonderfully. She's tired but fine." Luke pushed past her and into the room, his eyes finding Anna immediately. She was propped up in bed, sweaty and exhausted and more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, and in her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was the smallest person Luke had ever seen. "Luke," Anna said softly, "come meet your daughter." He crossed to the bed on shaking legs and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. She had Anna's eyes and a shock of dark hair, and when Luke touched her impossibly small hand, her fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. "Rose," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Hello, Rose." Anna was crying and laughing at the same time. "She's perfect. Isn't she perfect?" "She's perfect," Luke agreed, unable to look away from this miracle they'd made. Just like her mother. Dr. Harrison gave them instructions about care and feeding, but Luke barely heard. He was too busy staring at his daughter, at his wife, at the family he'd somehow been given, despite doing nothing to deserve it. When everyone finally left them alone, Jacob kissing Anna's forehead and shaking Luke's hand with tears in his eyes, the doctor promising to return the next day, Luke carefully climbed into bed beside Anna and their daughter. "We did it," Anna said, her head resting on Luke's shoulder as they both gazed at Rose. "We actually did it." "You did it," Luke corrected. "I just paced and panicked." "You gave me this," Anna said, gesturing to encompass everything, the baby, the home, the life they'd built. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed." Luke kissed the top of her head, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. "You gave me more. You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to stay, a reason to believe I could be someone worth loving. They sat together in the soft light of dawn, a family now in every sense of the word. Rose slept in her mother's arms, peaceful and trusting, and Luke made silent promises to this tiny person who'd just entered the world, that he'd protect her, that he'd love her, that he'd be better than his own father had been, would break the cycle of abandonment and pain that had defined his childhood, that he'd be worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall. Rose grew from a tiny newborn to a chubby, happy baby who smiled at her parents and grabbed at everything within reach. Luke discovered that fatherhood was both terrifying and wonderful, often in the same moment. He learned to change diapers and mix bottles and rock his daughter to sleep while singing off-key lullabies that made Anna laugh. Their house was filled with the sounds of family now. Rose's cries and laughter, Anna singing while she worked, Luke's voice reading aloud in the evenings while Anna nursed the baby. The loneliness and silence that had defined his life for so long were replaced by noise and chaos and a fullness that Luke wouldn't trade for anything. It was in October, just past their one-year anniversary, that Luke realized he'd fulfilled the terms of Big Tom's bet. 1 year married. The land and money were his to keep regardless of what happened now. He could walk away if he wanted to, could take his winnings and start over somewhere new. The thought was so absurd it made him laugh out loud. "What's funny?" Anna asked from where she sat in the rocking chair, Rose drowsing in her arms. "I just realized something," Luke said, crossing to kneel beside them. "Our year is up. The terms of the bet are fulfilled. I could leave if I wanted to." Anna's expression didn't change. "Are you going to?" "Not a chance," Luke said firmly. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life right here, with you and Rose, and whatever other children we're lucky enough to have. I'm going to build on this land and grow old in this house, and sit on that porch we rebuilt together until I'm too old to stand." "Good," Anna said simply, "because I'd hunt you down if you tried to leave." Luke laughed and kissed her, then kissed Rose's soft head. "I love you, both of you, more than I knew it was possible to love anything." "I love you too," Anna said. "My gambler, my husband, my partner." "You're fool," Luke added, remembering his words from the storm all those months ago. "My fool," Anna agreed with a smile, "but mine." Years later, when Rose was grown and had children of her own, people still told the story of Luke Tanner and Anna Blake. They told it in saloons and at dinner tables, passed it down to children as a lesson about pride and second chances and the strange ways love could find you when you least expected it. They talked about the bet that had brought them together, about the quiet girl who'd learned to shoot and the gambler who'd learned to stay. They talked about the storm and the standoff with Red Jack and all the ways a marriage born from humiliation had become the strongest partnership anyone in town had ever seen. But when people asked Luke about it, asked how he'd survived being trapped in a marriage he didn't want, he always gave the same answer. "She didn't tame me," he'd say, his arm around Anna's waist, his eyes soft with the kind of love that came from choosing each other every single day for decades. "She set me free." And Anna, standing beside the man who'd been forced to marry her and had somehow become the love of her life, would smile and add quietly, "We set each other free." Because that was the truth of it. Two people trapped by circumstances beyond their control had found freedom in each other. Two prisoners of expectation and fear had built something real and lasting from the wreckage of a cruel bet. Two strangers had become partners, then lovers, then the kind of family that endured through storms and dangers and all the challenges that life threw at them. The gambler had lost a hand of cards and won everything that mattered. The quiet girl had agreed to a marriage of convenience and found a love that transformed her. And together, they'd proven that sometimes the worst thing that could happen to you was actually the best thing in disguise. The house on Cottonwood Lane stood for generations, shelter to the family that Luke and Anna built together. The land prospered under their careful stewardship, passing eventually to Rose and then to her children and beyond. The silver bird necklace became a family heirloom, worn by daughters and granddaughters who heard the story of how their great-grandmother had found the courage to fly. And on quiet